Hello? Is it finally good? Testing, test, test. Okay, good. Testing. Okay. It sounds normal, I guess. I help. Okay. It's annoying when I don't know why it does that. I tried to sleep through the whole day. I popped melatonins last night. I still had trouble getting to sleep, which sucks. But that's okay. I don't know why my mic, the gain and stuff, always likes to shift itself around. Testing, test, test. Hello, testing, testing. Yeah, okay, it is what it is. But yeah, I tried to sleep through the whole day, but I can't sleep anymore, so here I am. And my mouth's not working either. What did you guys get for Christmas? What did you guys do? What did you eat? I made a TV dinner, and that's what I'm eating right now. But probably later, I'll go and cook rice and Japanese curry. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, fun. You enjoy? Max made me such a sweet Christmas card, too. Thank you again for that, Max. I want to watch this. Hell, it's not showing it. Here. Oh, that's cool. Yeah. That's fun. You have such a big family, you know?
Hello guys and gals, me Mudahar, and today's video is brought to you by our friends over at that one crappy uncle that loves to have a debate with you every time. I don't mean to say crappy uncle like I'm just being bad about it. Obviously I love everyone in my family, but sometimes some people love to debate. Now, you probably noticed a video by Charlie. It was actually uploaded not too long ago. I actually just got home from work, but this has been brewing for a little bit. Charlie talked about CIA confirmed life on Mars, to which the CIA did not.
Oh my
Ow,
gosh.
ow, God, I hit my.
Really?
Oh, God. Ow. CIA did not
Oh,
confirm life
ow.
on Mars, okay? Before I actually injured myself. That's going to leave it. Oof, ow. Oof.
Oh, they didn't?
Ooh, I really hit a nerve there. But, ladies and gentlemen, to give you an idea, the actual
I heard
source
that
of
they
my
did.
debate with family comes from this Daily Mail article that gets sent around. Now, I have a rule that if anybody sends me Daily Mail articles, I immediately never contact them again and we cut our communications. But because in this situation I am actually unfortunately related by blood, okay, I want to read this. CIA doc claims life did exist on Mars, and it was a population of very
Max,
large
yeah.
people who built pyramids. So, you read a headline like
Oh
this
my
and you're like,
gosh.
whoa, that's crazy. There's no way that's real.
That's
Obviously, it
crazy.
isn't real. But the thing about, the Daily Mail is, much like TMZ or much like any bullshit paper that you read, any paper that you can recognize from like the grocery store section where the gum is located by the checkout, that's when you know you should run away. So anyways, this comes from their science and tech team. All right. While NASA is searching for life on Mars, a CIA document claimed it was found 40 years ago. So again, you go down over
Oh
here,
my
and they
god.
said the report details how the agency used the astral projection, the idea that a person's spirit can travel through the astral plane.
True. True.
Woo!
I've
All
done
right,
it.
we're
I've
getting
done
into the
it
good
before.
stuff today. The
True.
study was part of Project Stargate, a secret U.S. Army unit established in 1979 focused on anomalous phenomena, including remote viewing, telepathy, and psychokinesis. There is a fucking game based off this whole project called, I think it was PsyOps, the Mindgate conspiracy back on the PlayStation 2, where every single one of these abilities mentioned was a gameplay feature. Now, while that was a game based on fiction, this is an actual real life project, but we'll kind of talk about it towards the
Isn't there like
later half
another
of it.
one? Control or
Obviously,
Beyond Two
the
Souls?
debate that I was having with family was like, well,
Merry
Muda, it's
Christmas,
the
bro.
CIA. They're clearly smarter than all of us. I mean, you really think the US government would dump millions of dollars into something if it didn't have anything tangible? To which, let me
I'm just
remind
eating
you,
and
okay, the CIA
watching stuff right
probably
now.
jumped into the stash of crack cocaine that was designated for the minorities anyways, and decided one day to spend an office party with it. But reality explains that Project Stargate was actually something the CIA started way early on in their life, okay? Around the 60s, or actually the beginning, the 70s. This effort was initiated in response to CIA concerns about reported Soviet investigations of psychic phenomenon. Between 69 and 71, U.S. intelligence sources concluded the Soviet Union was engaged in psychotronics research. By the 70s, they were spending approximately 60 million rubles per year on it, and over
I'm eating a
300
TV
million by
dinner.
1975. So the money and personnel devoted to this suggested they had achieved breakthroughs, even though the matter was considered speculative, controversial,
I
and
might cook
fringy. They
curry
literally
later
saw their ops spending a shit ton of money on it, and the US was
tonight.
like, hold on, we can probably shuffle $20
What
million
about you? What
for
did
this
you eat?
project, which again, for the US government, is nothing but a fucking rounding error. So I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. All right, we'll get back to Project Stargate in a bit. The actual information came out of the CIA reading room documents. I don't know if this is like some fucking Christmas gift they gave to us, but this is actually a level of delusion that has me siding more with the flat earthists than anything. And you know how fucking, brutal I am with that. So you can imagine what I think here. So this is Mars Exploration, May 22nd, 1984. This is 9 pages. I don't expect my audience to be the Daily Mail audience. I'm sure we can get through this together, okay? All right? Maybe we'll add some Subway
Oh, heck
Surfers on the
yeah.
side. I don't know. Sealed envelopes coupled with geographic coordinates, okay?
You
So the
do
sealed
anything cool
envelope was
for
given to the
Christmas?
subject immediately prior to the interview, okay? So the person they're interviewing got this envelope. The envelope was not opened until after the interview. In the envelope was a 3x5 card with the following information: the planet Mars, time of interest approximately in 1 million years BC. So they got selected geographic coordinates provided by the party that they were given verbally to the subject during the interview, right? So it's interesting that we've got 3 topics here: Mars, a million years BC, and the time of interest. Well, that is the approximate time of interest. So this is how the actual interview went, okay? So they sat down. The interviewer goes, all right, now, using the information in the envelope I provided, Exclusively focusing your attention now, using the information in the envelope, focus on 40.89 degrees north, 9.55 degrees west. And so the actual person they're interviewing goes, I want to say it looked like I don't know, it
Oh,
sort of
that's
looks,
cool.
I kind
What's
of
a
got an oblique
24
view of
hour? Like a
a pyramid or a
sleepover?
pyramid form. It's very high, as we all were at the CIA offices that day. It's kind of
Or
sitting
you
in a
mean like a
large
24-hour
depressed
stream?
area. All right. It's yellowish, ochre colored. All right.
No, I
Move
didn't
in
do
time to
anything.
the time
Just
indicated in the
normal,
envelope I
another day
provide
for
you and
me.
describe what's happening. I'm tracking
I tried to
severe,
sleep through
severe
Christmas
clouds, more
today,
like dust
but
storm.
I can't sleep
It's
anymore, so I'm awake
geologic
now.
problem. Seems to be like a, just a minute. I gotta iron this out. It's really weird. Just report your raw perceptions of this time. You're still early in the session. I'm looking at it in a after effect of a major geological problem. Okay, go back to the time before the problem. Um, Total difference. It's a yep.
Oh,
Oh
that's
hell!
cool.
It's like a
Yeah.
mountain of dirt appear and then disappear before you go. Large flat surfaces, very smooth angles, walls, and they're really large. I mean, they're megalithic. Ah, all right. At this period in time, now before the geologic activity, look around in and around this area and see if you can find any activity. So this is
I
where
want to
the
know more
aliens
about the
kind of come
man
from.
on
So
Mars.
we'll
You
just
know,
look
the
here. Okay,
face?
I'm seeing it's like a perception
Or the
of a
man on
shadow
the
of
moon?
people. Very tall, thin. It's only a shadow. It's not as if they were there. It's not that they're there anymore. Go back to a period of time where they were there. It's like I get
But
a
I
lot
think
of
it's
static
probably
on the
just a
line and
natural
everything. It's breaking
formation.
up all the time, very fragmentary pieces. Just report the raw data. Don't try to put things together. Just report the raw data. I keep seeing very large people. They appear to be thin and tall. So some in the Minecraft community would call this Endermen. Some would call this giants. I would say that
Enderman?
it's probably just aliens, all right? That's what they're seeing. Shit. They're very large people wearing some strange clothing. All right. Now holding in this time period, I
Villagers.
want to move from your physical
Pillagers.
location in the space to another physical location. So yeah, again, it's describing this pyramid structure and like I guess you could say the society these giants live in. I want to remind people as we proceed towards the end of this. This is an actual document provided by the Central Intelligence Agency and declassified. I believe this goes all the way back to 1984, so times were a lot different then. But anyways, to go into here, all right, this is the end, right? Very tall again, very large people, but they're thin. They look thin because of their height, and they dress like in oh hell. It's like a real light silk, and it's not flowing type of clothes. It's like cut to fit. They were aliens, I think. Move closer to one of them and ask them to tell you about themselves. They're
Or
ancient
they were
people.
aliens, I think.
They're dying. It's past their time or age. Tell me about this. They're very philosophic about it. They're looking for a way to survive, and they just can't. Plus 40 minutes, definite voltage reversal.
So
Can't seem to get their way
philosophical.
out. They can't seem to find their way out, so they're hanging on while they look or wait for something to return or something coming with the answer. What is it they're waiting for? There evidently was a group or a party of them that went to find a new place to live. It's like I'm getting all kinds of overwhelming input of the corruption of their environment. It's failing very rapidly, and this group went somewhere, like a long way to find another place to live. What was the cause of the atmospheric disturbance or environmental disturbance? I see a picture of like, oh hell.
What
It's
is this
almost a
role
warp in a,
play?
oh god, this is difficult. It's like going,
Cold,
let's see, the
cold
raw data.
readings.
Okay, I got a globe. It's like a globe that goes through a comet's tail, or it's through a river or something. It's all very cosmic. It's like space pictures. All right, now before you leave this individual, ask him if he
It's like
knows if
space
there's any way that
pictures.
you ask him if he knows who you are and if there's a way you can help him. All I get is that they've just doesn't know who I am, thinks he perceives I'm a hallucination or something. So, yeah, that's effectively kind of how it ends, ladies and gentlemen. What you just witnessed was a CIA Project Stargate interview with somebody who was remote viewing, to a different point in time, to a different point in space as well, too. Now, the thing is, the CIA does not necessarily prove anything, but what the CIA does is do Operation Stargate. Now, again, to go back to when they started this project, obviously in response to the Soviet
It'd
government,
be
there
funny
was
if they were like
absolutely an
describing
important
Star
aspect of this
Wars.
known as remote viewing. And remote
He's a
viewing
man
is popularly known
cloaked
as
in
extrasensory
black.
perception, or the ability of
He has
human
a
beings to
sword.
perceive
It's made out of
information
light.
and
It's
imagery of
red.
remote geographical targets. Advanced
Hi,
practitioners
Ken.
of the Indian yoga
Merry
system were
Christmas.
well acquainted with Divya Drishti, okay? The paper deals with experiments conducted in the USA
I'm watching
in which certain
aliens.
individuals were trained to acquire remote viewing capabilities for collecting military intelligence. So yeah, this is before the era. Remember, this is like back in the 70s, 80s, very early 90s, right? You didn't really have any drones or any form of like technology as you do nowadays in order to track targets around the world. Remember, nowadays in the year 2024, if you're on Uncle Sam's shit list, they can kill you from any point on the world without without them having to lift a finger at this point. The amount of spies the US government has in basically every world government is absolutely insane. There's probably a spy sitting right next to the Prime Minister of Canada, as there is a spy sitting right next to the Prime Minister of insert whatever country. There's a spy sitting in nearly every intelligence wing in every intelligence agency that is around the world. And this shouldn't be a real shock to you. The US spy system, if you really look into it, goes pretty international. But beyond just human intelligence, you're talking about a level of signal and technological intelligence.
Yeah, it's not real. But you know what is? This.
Today's story is about
This
one of
is
the most
real.
famous paranormal events in history. But it's not famous because of how outlandish the details are. Instead, it's famous for its credibility. Not only were there 12 witnesses who saw this thing happen, but also there was a NASA engineer who investigated this event and ultimately concluded that it must have happened because of tangible proof. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's stick deodorant.
Alvers.
Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car while her 7-year-old grandson, named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The three of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicki began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicki turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicki noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicki just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway
No, it's a
road,
drone.
that light that Vicki really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it
I'm
didn't really
eating a
seem like it was a
TV
plane.
dinner, so
Now, at
yeah.
first, Vicki thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car
I just woke
was
up.
getting
I tried
much
to sleep
warmer and
through
stuffier than
all
any of the heat
Christmas,
settings
but I
would allow it
couldn't.
to get, to the point where Vicki was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicki sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to
How
do
about
with the
you?
heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicki screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path, maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange-looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just
Oh my
stared in
God.
shock at this craft. Like, it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicki, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond shaped, and it was letting out these strange loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at
So
Vicki,
nice.
Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. You know, the road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicky and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away. But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicky and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicky, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here. And Vicky gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicky was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicky believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicky was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicky out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicky, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft, like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a US military exercise of some sort.
You don't think the US military would roll out the red carpet for Jesus Christ himself if and when he was to return? You don't think they'd be welcomed by a swarm of helicopters and stuff? I think they would. It's the least they could do, right?
And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out, they said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen, they just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. You know, she tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft.
Sometimes I think
and so it was a very long night with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time. But eventually they both did fall asleep. And then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red. And she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up and she dialed Betty's number, and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic, not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her, she couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet. And so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty, and eventually, Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door.
Dead inside,
and
don't
immediately
open.
she saw Betty on her bed, and Betty looked horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated, when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body. He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive.
Did she
It
tell
had
the
to be
doctor
that
it was
craft.
aliens?
And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it.
No.
But as she was wrapping up her story,
The doctor
Vicky was
said,
suddenly
"I'll be right
overcome
back."
with embarrassment, because the doctor was now staring at her
no,
like she was totally out of her mind. A month later,
like,
in
"I'll be
early
right
February
back."
of 1981, Vicky was at her
The
kitchen
MIB
table with the
show up.
phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about the strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call, because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital. She was in constant pain. She still had burns all over her. And in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with, but it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music, It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator. But the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO research center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said, that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they've seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, I mean, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case, and so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change. Except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident
Oh my god, thank you.
site
Thank
out
you,
on that
Ken.
road, and they'd come along with
Oh my
construction
gosh.
vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch
That was like a
of that road,
special
taken
fish
it with
too.
them,
That was
and
like
left.
chopped
And
up
that particular
sashimi.
stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut.
Have you guys
However,
seen a
not long
UFO
after John
before?
learned this information, a group of UFO
I have.
scientists descended on the road
I was
to
like 10
find this
years
scorch
old.
mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cash Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers. The official Mr. Ballin Podcast YouTube channel